For centuries, European explorers, beginning with Christopher Columbus in 1492, sought a navigable passage as a possible trade route to the west to reach the Spice Islands, but they were blocked by North, Central and South America and by ice or rough waters. On Martin Waldseemüller's world map of 1507, which was published only 15 years after Columbus's voyages, the east coast of North America is fairly well detailed, up to the St. Lawrence estuary, but north of that there is nothing. Incidentally, this is the first known map to show Asia and America as separate entities. By the mid-1800s, the search was focused on the Northwest Passage, which had become the great unsolved riddle of polar exploration. In the United Kingdom, the search was led by John Barrow, who was Second Secretary to the Admiralty from 1804 to 1845. In his position at the Admiralty, Barrow was a great promoter of Arctic voyages of discovery, including those of John Ross, William Edward Parry, James Clark Ross and John Franklin. The Barrow Strait and the Canadian Arctic, as well as Point Barrow and the city of Barrow in Alaska, are all named after him. Not surprisingly, the Royal Navy's efforts were based on using ships, and their activity intensified after the loss of the Franklin expedition in 1848, as Lady Franklin pressurised the authorities to search for her husband. This pressure led them to using overland expeditions to try and determine what exactly was stopping the ships. All of the land-based exploration relied upon the cooperation of the Hudson Bay Company, who had a communications network linking forts and trading posts well into the north of Canada, which provided both accommodation and supplies for parties heading north. The Hudson Bay Company was incorporated by English Royal Charter in 1670, and it was granted a commercial monopoly over the entire Hudson Bay drainage basin, which was known as Rupert's Land, where it operated as the de facto government, even issuing its own currency. From 1668, the Hudson Bay Company established a network of forts on the shores of the Hudson Bay. Fort Severn lay at the mouth of the River Severn, on the shores of Hudson Bay, about 160 miles southeast of York Factory. Native Indians travelling to the Hudson Bay forts with their furs were being intercepted by independent fur traders who bought the furs. This loss of business made the Hudson Bay Company move inland in 1774 with the building of Cumberland House by Samuel Hearne. Many other inland forts and trading posts followed. Although not strictly an Arctic explorer, it is impossible to mention the Hudson Bay Company without saying a little about George Simpson, who was governor from 1820 to 1860. He was, in practice, the British Viceroy for the whole of Rupert's Land. In 1824, he crossed Canada by foot and canoe in 80 days, 20 days faster than the previous record. In 1828, he did a round trip across Canada with his dog, Mistress, and personal piper, and this 5,000-mile journey still stands as the longest North American canoe trip ever made in one season. In 1841, he left London, crossed Canada by canoe, visited the Hudson Bay Company post in Hawaii in 1842, and returned via Okhotsk, Yakutsk, Lake Baikal, and St. Petersburg, arriving back in London in October. This is the first known circumnavigation of the world on foot. The Hudson Bay Company were content to trade within Rupert's Land, but their competitor, the North West Company, had to go west and north of Rupert's Land to find business. So the North West Company's staff included most of the key explorers of these regions, including Alexander Mackenzie, Simon Fraser, David Thompson, and Peter Pond. Another feature of the staff of the North West Company was that they were almost entirely Scottish. In 1821, these two companies merged, which greatly increased the number of forts and trading posts under control of the Hudson Bay Company. Since the Hudson Bay Company operated under a British Royal Charter, the Royal Navy expected that the Hudson Bay Company would cooperate with them and allow them to use their infrastructure for their land-based expeditions. Canada's river system is dominated in the south by the North and South Saskatchewan rivers, flowing from the Rocky Mountains all the way to Lake Winnipeg, from where there were routes down the Nelson River to the Hudson Bay, and across a series of small lakes to Lake Superior. The north and centre of Canada is dominated by the Mackenzie River, with its feeders the Slave River and the Athabasca River. The communications network of the fur trading companies developed along these rivers and across the four large lakes that they join up. Note the Coppermine and Back rivers flowing north into the Arctic Ocean, which provided important routes for the early explorers into the unknown territory through which the Northwest Passage would eventually be discovered. The area that no ships had been able to penetrate lay between Coronation Gulf and the Victoria Strait. Most of these names were given to honour either the explorer or their sponsors, and all of the names shown here will crop up again in this presentation. The history of the search to find the elusive Northwest Passage is dominated by Franklin's infamous expedition of 1845. The rest can be divided into what went before and what came after that fateful event. The first expedition of note was Henry Hudson's 1607 exploration of Hudson Bay, when the crew mutinied and cast Hudson and his son adrift in a small boat. They were never seen again. By the mid-1700s, Davis had discovered the Davis Strait, Baffin had discovered Baffin Bay, and Hudson had discovered Hudson Bay, so the map of eastern Canada now looked like this. Note that the only channel into or out of Baffin Bay is the Davis Strait, although Davis had seen the entry of Lancaster Sound and named it after one of his sponsors. In 1770, Hearne made a remarkable land expedition to the shores of Coronation Gulf, and was the first Western person to see the Arctic Ocean north of Canada. In 1789, Alexander Mackenzie made another remarkable journey when he followed the Mackenzie River to its mouth, where it discharges into the Arctic Ocean. In 1806, as a break from pillaging French ships in the Napoleonic Wars, HMS Blossom, under the command of Beechey, had a trip into the Arctic, reaching Point Barrow, the most northerly point of the mainland of North America. In 1818, Captain John Ross took the naval ships Isabella and the Alexander, captained by William Edward Parry, under instruction to go northward through Davis Strait and Baffin Bay and attempt to find an open passage round the northeast corner of North America, and ultimately reach the Pacific through Bering Strait. They entered Lancaster Sound, but Ross turned back, claiming that the sound was blocked by a chain of mountains, which he called Crocker's Mountains, after the First Lord of the Admiralty. Nobody on Parry's ship had seen any mountains. On their return, Ross advised the Admiralty that there was no passage out of Baffin Bay. Barrow was furious. Discrepancies existed in the accounts of the topography, and rumours flew about to the non-existence of Crocker's Mountains, and worse of all, it was believed that Ross had lost his nerve and returned too early. The following year, Parry returned to Lancaster Sound and proved that Crocker's Mountains did not exist. He sailed all the way to Melville Island on an unusually ice-free year and claimed the £5,000 reward for furthest west. He had to saw a channel in the ice to get his ships into a safe winter haven. Ross's reputation was in tatters, and he would never work for the Admiralty again, and word had leaked to the press about the Admiralty's displeasure with him, causing cartoons to be published ridiculing his account of the voyage. Here we see Parry having an encounter with the Inuit, a frequent occurrence for these expeditions. Franklin, accompanied by Richardson and Back, led a Royal Navy overland expedition to try and reach the area marked Terra Incognito on the maps and to continue east all of the way to the Hudson Bay. The 5,500-mile expedition was a failure. Their supplies ran out at Fort Enterprise on the second winter, and Back made a 1,200-mile journey to obtain supplies, but only got enough to satisfy their immediate needs. The expedition turned out to be a fiasco of bad planning, bad luck, and unreliable allies. They did reach Terra Incognito, but ran out of supplies before completing the mapping. There followed a desperate retreat in a state of starvation, with lichen the only thing to eat. 11 of the party of 19 men died amid accusations of murder and cannibalism. In Canada, there was vehement criticism of the expedition, but back in the UK, Franklin was greeted as a hero, and he was promoted to the rank of commander. Parry's goal in 1821 was to find a passage near the northwest end of Hudson Bay. In September, Lieutenant Reid trekked 100 miles west along the Fury and Hecla Strait to the ice-filled Gulf of Boothia. Parry's next trip in 1824 was to Prince Regent Inlet, but he was forced to winter at a place he called Port Bowen on the eastern shore. The following spring they were caught by wind and ice, and the Fury was driven against the western shore and damaged by the ensuing pressure. The crew of Fury were taken back to England in the Hecla. In 1825, Franklin and Richardson descended the Mackenzie River. Then Franklin himself travelled westwards along the coast with the ultimate goal of reaching Icy Cape. He made it to Brownlow Point, just east of Prudhoe Bay, before turning back, and he travelled 2,048 miles in 80 days. At the mouth of the Mackenzie River, Richardson turned east, and his party surveyed the coast round to the mouth of the Coppermine River. They then returned to their winter quarters on the Great Bear Lake by way of the Coppermine River, having travelled 1,987 miles in 60 days. This map shows the full extent of what was known about the area in 1826, and here is the same map updated with what we know today. In 1829, John Ross was still out of favour with the Admiralty, but he obtained funding from Booth's Gin to mount an expedition to the Arctic in the Victory, a side-wheel paddle steamer. In the course of the expedition, they made sledge journeys to the west coast of King William Island and to the magnetic North Pole. They were stuck in the ice for 2 winters in the Gulf of Boothia, and then abandoned the ship and walked and rowed small boats to the head of Prince Regent Inlet, where they were rescued by a passing ship, the Isabella. In 1833, George Back set off to look for John Ross's expedition, which was icebound in the Gulf of Boothia. However, news reached him that Ross had returned to England, but he carried on down the Back River to Chantry Inlet. He retraced his steps to Fort Reliance, where he overwintered before returning to England. In 1836, Thomas Simpson, cousin of George Simpson, the Hudson Bay Company governor, and Peter Dease led a Hudson Bay Company expedition, which was based at Fort Confidence. They filled in the gap in the mapping of the mainland coast from Franklin's 1825 furthest point west along to Point Barrow, thus completing the charting of that part of the coast. The following year they explored to the east and sailed for the first time through Dease Strait and the Queen Maud Gulf, found the Adelaide Peninsula and Simpson Strait to its north, and reached Chantry Inlet. During George Back's 1836 to 1837 expedition, his ship, HMS Terror, became locked in advancing ice for 10 months in the Hudson Strait, and on one occasion the ice pushed the ship 40 feet up the side of a cliff. The badly damaged ship limped home across the Atlantic and beached on the west coast of Ireland. On Franklin's catastrophic expedition of 1845, all 129 men and the two ships, Erebus and Terror, were lost. There were no survivors. Parks Canada have taken a leading role in the modern study of the course of events that led to this tragedy. This is their video of the story.
Under the command of Sir John Franklin, two ships, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set off from England in 1845. They were to explore the Canadian Arctic in search of the last unexplored sections of the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage is a sea route that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, passing through the Arctic Ocean and along the northern coast of North America. European explorers have been looking for this possible western trade route from Europe to Asia by sea for centuries. The Erebus and Terror, as well as the entire crew of 129 men, vanished into the Canadian Arctic, never to return. Sir John Franklin was an Arctic explorer and a British Royal Navy officer. In 1819 and 1825, he led two expeditions into the Canadian Arctic, and his third and final expedition, in 1845, was an attempt to find a route via the Northwest Passage. He served during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, as well as the War of 1812. On February 7, 1845, Sir John Franklin was named Expedition Commander. Franklin was granted command of Erebus, with Francis Crozier his executive officer and commander of Terror. James Fitzjames was appointed second in command of Erebus. Terror and Erebus were well built and equipped. Steam engines allowed the ships to travel at a speed of 4 knots. The ships also included reinforced bows made of heavy beams and iron plates, and an internal steam heating system. There was also a system of iron wells that allowed the screw propellers and iron rudders to be retracted into the hull to protect them from damage. They were also given enough food to last at least 3 years. In 1813, the Royal Navy built HMS Terror, a specialized warship and a newly created bomb vessel. She fought in many battles during the War of 1812. Terror was repurposed into a polar exploration vessel in the mid-1830s. The Royal Navy built the HMS Erebus in 1826 as a bomb vessel. Erebus was refurbished as an exploration vessel after 2 years of service in the Mediterranean Sea. On May 19, 1845, the expedition set sail from Greenhithe, England, with 134 officers and crew. For supplies, the ships headed north to Aberdeen and the Orkney Islands, Scotland. They then traveled to the Whalefish Islands in western Greenland's Disco Bay. Some crew members left the expedition, and it continued on with 129 men on board. British whalers last saw the ships north of Baffin Island at the entrance of Lancaster Sound in late July. When no word was received in 1847, search parties were dispatched. Various expeditions would search for the explorers for 12 years. On Beechey Island, the first artifacts were discovered, including the remains of a winter camp from 1845 to 1846, as well as the grave sites of 3 of Franklin's crew members. While surveying for the Hudson's Bay Company in 1854, Scottish explorer John Rae learned of the Franklin's party's likely fate from Inuit hunters. He was told that both ships had become icebound and that the men had attempted to reach safety on foot but had died of exposure and starvation, with some resorting to cannibalism. Many artifacts that were identified as belonging to Franklin and his men were shown to Rae by the Inuit. On another search, Chief Factor James Anderson and HBC employee James Stewart paddled north to the mouth of Back River. A group of Inuit informed them in July 1855 that a number of foreigners had starved to death along the coast. Their fate remained unknown until 1859. A final search mission led by Captain Francis Leopold McClintock and sent by Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, reached King William Island south and west of Lancaster Sound. Some skeletons of the ship's crew were discovered, as well as a written account of the expedition up to April 25, 1848. This two-part Victory Point note, found in a cairn on King William Island, was the only source of first-hand information on the expedition's progress. Between 1845 and 1846, the Franklin expedition spent the winter on Beechey Island, where 3 crew members died and were buried. They were then trapped in the ice in Victoria Strait off King William Island in September 1846. The crew wintered off King William Island in 1846-47 and 1847-48, according to the second portion of the Victory Point note, signed by Fitzjames and Crozier on April 25, 1848. It was also stated that Franklin had died on June 11, 1847. On the 22nd of April, 1848, the remaining crew abandoned the ships and intended to walk over the island and across the sea ice to the Back River on the mainland, beginning on the 26th of April, 1848. By this time, in addition to Franklin, 8 officers and 15 men had already died. The Victory Point note is the expedition's last known communication. All of the remaining crew members are thought to have died on their journey to Back River, according to archaeological findings. 30 to 40 men made it to the mainland's northern coast before dying, still hundreds of kilometers from the nearest outpost. Between 1860 and 1869, 2 expeditions led by Charles Francis Hall, who lived among the Inuit, discovered camps, graves, and artifacts on the southern coast of King William Island. Local Inuit led Hall to a shallow grave on King William Island in 1869, which contained well-preserved skeletal remains and fragments of clothing. Despite the fact that Hall came to the conclusion that the whole Franklin crew was dead, he acquired hundreds of pages of Inuit testimony. These included visits to Franklin's ships and an encounter with a party of white men on the southern shore of King William Island. Inuit accounts point strongly to most of the remaining 105 crew actually surviving past 1848 and managing to sail one of the ships down along the coast of King William Island before it sank, with some crew members surviving as late as 1851. The Franklin Expedition Forensic Anthropology Project visited King William Island in June 1981. They wanted to locate artifacts and skeletal remains so that modern forensics might be used to determine the identities and causes of death of the 129 crew. They noticed areas of pitting and scaling on the bones of Franklin's crew, which are common in cases of vitamin C deficiency, the cause of scurvy. They also noticed skeletal patterns suggesting cannibalism. The crewmen's bones were also found to have an unusually high level of lead. After fragments of hundreds of food tins were examined, one of the possible sources of high lead levels was the lead solder used to seal the tins. The seams were found to be badly soldered with lead, most likely coming in contact with the food. Following further investigation, it was discovered that the ship's distilled water systems could have been another possible source of lead. In 1993, a team of archaeologists and forensic anthropologists uncovered nearly 400 bones, bone fragments, and artifacts. These bones were found to have high levels of lead and numerous cut marks, consistent with defleshing. Some believe that at least some of Franklin's men resorted to cannibalism in their dying hours. Their deaths were most likely caused by a combination of cold, malnutrition, and disease such as scurvy, and also pneumonia and tuberculosis, all of which was made worse by lead poisoning. More recent chemical re-examination has cast doubt on the lead poisoning. And according to a 2016 study, the crew's bad health may have been caused by malnutrition, specifically zinc deficiency. In 2008, the Canadian government launched a mission to uncover additional archaeological evidence of the Franklin expedition. And in September 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was discovered in Wilmot and Crampton Bay, near the Adelaide Peninsula. In September 2016, the wreck of HMS Terror was discovered in Terror Bay on the south coast of King William Island, noted to be in excellent condition. The ship was remarkably well preserved. Terror's hull was still intact, proving that the ship had not broken up in the ice. The wrecks were found many miles south of their last known location off the northwest coast of King William Island. Some believe the Terror must have been crewed and sailed to this location. HMS Terror was discovered 92 kilometers or 57 miles south of the location where the ship was reported abandoned. The discoveries would not have been possible without the support and knowledge shared by Inuit. Another positive accomplishment was the mapping of thousands of miles of unsurveyed coastline in the Canadian Arctic. Franklin's selected passage took Erebus and Terror into ice that didn't usually clear in summer, whereas the passage along the island's east coast regularly clears in summer and was eventually used by Roald Amundsen in its successful navigation of the Northwest Passage in 1903 to 1906. We may never fully know all the details of what happened to Franklin's lost expedition unless more evidence is found.
This map shows the trail of devastation and tragedy that was left behind by the Franklin expedition as they headed south to try and reach the Back River. Over the next 10 years, over 40 expeditions set out to look for Franklin's lost expedition. The wreck of Erebus was discovered in 2014 and that of HMS Terror in 2016. The wrecks were initially located using side-scan sonar and later examined by divers who have recovered many artifacts from the ships. John Ray was born in Orkney within sight of the village of Stromness, which was the last stopping point for ships crossing to Canada and where they filled up their water barrels. As a child, John would have been familiar with all of the activities of these ships in Stromness Harbour. He went on to qualify as a doctor in Edinburgh, after which he signed on as a surgeon on a Hudson Bay Company ship. Early ice that winter forced him to overwinter at York Factory, where he stayed for the next 10 years. He learned how to live off the land like a native, wore native clothing, and working with the local craftsmen, even designing his own snowshoes. This knowledge and his prodigious stamina allowed him to travel great distances with little equipment and few followers, unlike many other explorers of the Victorian age. He also learned to speak the native languages and could converse fluently with the Inuit. In 1846, Ray was tasked to go west as far as the most easterly point achieved by the 1936 Dease and Simpson expedition, which was Chantry Inlet. He went north in two 22-foot boats to Repulse Bay, where he set up camp. He then dragged one of his boats 40 miles to the Gulf of Boothia and explored a short distance up its east side before returning to winter camp at Repulse Bay. The next year, he explored further up the east coast of the Gulf of Boothia and did a circular trip round the Simpson Peninsula. By 1849, it was clear that Franklin was lost, and the Royal Navy sent out 3 expeditions to look for him. The first was William Pullen, who was a Royal Navy officer, and he became the first European to sail along the north coast of Alaska from the Bering Strait to the Mackenzie River in Canada in a single journey. He travelled in large boats to the mouth of the Mackenzie River, where he and a small party of men left to ascend the Mackenzie River in small boats. He overwintered at Fort Simpson, and the following year he descended the Mackenzie River and tried to go east, but he was stopped by pack ice. He returned to Fort Simpson, from where he went back to England via York Factory. Ray was returning from an unsuccessful journey to Coronation Gulf in 1849, when he met William Pullen at Fort Simpson, and while they were together, Ray received orders to return to the Arctic. He returned to overwinter in Fort Confidence, and in 1851 he made 2 remarkable journeys, charting the unknown coastline of Victoria Island. In the early summer, he crossed Coronation Gulf and travelled 170 miles to the northwest, charting the coast and searching for any traces of the Franklin expedition. He returned to his camp on the Coppermine River. He was off again in late July on a 1,000-mile journey to the east, along the southern shore of Coronation Gulf and the southern shore of Victoria Island.
Let me tell you about the greatest Arctic explorer you've probably never heard of. John Ray was a doctor for Hudson's Bay Company. And in their service, Dr. Ray learned that he loved to explore. He led 4 Arctic expeditions back in the 1840s and 50s, back when most explorers either froze or starved to death. But Ray knew how to live off the land. He learned from the Inuit. He built snow houses. And he survived the Arctic winters. It was Ray who discovered the fate of the doomed Franklin expedition. And it was Ray who found the last missing link of the fabled Northwest Passage.
Inside Kirkwall Cathedral, you will find a memorial to John Ray, whose prodigious feats of exploration were ignored by the British establishment as a result of Lady Franklin's attempts to glorify the dead of her husband's fateful expedition. Lady Franklin's also wanted to discredit Ray because of his report that, according to the Inuit, there had been cannibalism on the expedition. She enlisted the help of her friend Charles Dickens to publish 3 pamphlets discrediting both Ray and the evidence that he had obtained from the Inuit. She was entirely successful in destroying him, and Ray was written out of the history of Arctic exploration by the British establishment.
We leave you tonight with a tribute to the most famous Arctic explorer you've probably never heard of. John Ray charted countless miles of unexplored territory in Canada's north. Instead of being honored for his remarkable achievements, Victorian England vilified him. Ray was discredited for his ghastly discovery about the Franklin expedition. CTV's Daniel Hamamjian explains.
Westminster Abbey. Here, more than 3,000 monarchs, politicians, poets and scientists are either buried or memorialized. Among them, a national hero, explorer Captain John Franklin, whose new neighbor had been until recently airbrushed from the history books.
This is a little act of reconciliation.
Finding the legendary Northwest Passage was one of the great 19th century obsessions. So too was the hunt for the lost Franklin expedition. In comes Scottish explorer John Ray. He was hired by the Hudson's Bay Company to map out the Arctic coastline, which he did exceptionally well thanks to skills he learned from the Inuit.
His relationship with the Inuit ensured his survival.
It is also through the Inuit that Ray discovered what really happened to the surviving Franklin crew. Starving and desperate, they resorted to cannibalism. The suggestion that British sailors would eat each other caused outrage.
An influential Victorian author had a hand in vilifying John Ray, and he is buried just a few meters away.
Literary giant Charles Dickens said Ray had been influenced by savages. His reputation never recovered. It's why these 2 Canadian women say they only recently found out they are the great-great-grandnieces of John Ray.
We suspect that he was deleted out of our family history when he was deleted out of Victorian establishment history.
And in thankful memory of John Ray,
It is rare for the Abbey to do this after a century.
I dedicate this memorial.
John Ray is now vindicated. His honor restored. Danielle Hamamjian, CTV News, London.
In 1850, at the age of 72, Ross undertook a 3rd voyage to the Arctic regions, this time in search of the expedition party of Sir John Franklin, which had not been heard from for 4 years. With financial support from the Hudson Bay Company, he sailed a private vessel, the schooner Felix, to Lancaster Sound. Failing to find Franklin or any of his men, Ross returned to England in October 1851. By 1850, Lady Jane Franklin had turned the search for her husband into a national priority, and the Admiralty ordered a new expedition to try and find Franklin, which involved several ships approaching from both the east and the west simultaneously. Robert McClure, captain of HMS Investigator, accompanied by HMS Enterprise, were tasked to approach from the west. They sailed round Cape Horn, up the Pacific, through the Bering Strait, and turned east along the north coast of Canada. The Investigator was abandoned in the pack ice in Mercy Bay on Banks Island when he met up with a party from Belcher's expedition who had come in from the east. Investigator's crew walked from Banks Island to Melville Island, where they were rescued by Belcher's ships. Thus McClure became the first person to transit the Northwest Passage and to circumnavigate the Americas. Edward Belcher's expedition of 1852 comprised of 5 ships, the largest to participate in the search for Franklin, and it was timed so that they were in the Arctic at the same time as McClure's expedition from the west. They roamed as far west as Melville Island and north of Lancaster Sound into the Wellington Channel and up to Northumberland Sound and Patrick Island. He rescued McClure's crew of the Investigator from Melville Island. In February 1854, he abandoned 4 of his ships and returned to England. He was court-martialed but was exonerated, but never received another active command. He was described as a tyrannical martinet who made every ship he commanded a floating hell. In 1855, at the request of the Admiralty, the Hudson Bay Company sent an expedition led by James Anderson to try and verify John Ray's story. He went down the Back River and reached Montreal Island in Chantry Inlet, where he found relics of Franklin's expedition, thereby confirming Ray's story. McClintock's 1857 expedition was the last of 5 expeditions privately financed by Lady Franklin to try and find out the fate of her husband's expedition. McClintock was tasked with trying to find out more about Ray's report from the Inuit about a ship being lost near King William Island. He sailed from Aberdeen on the steam yacht Fox, headed for Baffin Bay, where he continued up the Kennedy Channel between Greenland and Ellesmere Island, where they spent their first winter. They then entered Lancaster Sound and visited Beechey Island before heading down to the Bellot Strait, where they spent their second winter. They set off for King William Island on foot and found the cairn on the northwest of the island, which contained a note left by the Franklin expedition. They bought many relics of Franklin's expedition from the Inuit, who also gave them information about where to find the remains of the expedition. There they found a boat, skeletons, and many articles that had little value for survival in the Arctic, such as the ship's writing desk, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, sponges, slippers, hair combs, and many books. This Admiralty chart of the Arctic Sea shows just how much chart making had improved by 1853. An American, Charles Hall, made 3 expeditions into the Arctic between 1863 and 1869, which were all troublesome because of his poor leadership and on the last expedition he was murdered by arsenic poisoning. However, he collected useful testimony about the Franklin expedition from the Inuit, as well as artifacts. About 50 years later, the first transit of the Northwest Passage was made by Roald Amundsen in 1906 in a small herring fishing vessel. He spent 2 years on King William Island learning survival skills from the Inuit before moving on to complete the journey. These survival skills included how to use dogs for transport and the use of animal skins for clothing, which were key factors in allowing him to subsequently beat Robert Falcon Scott in the race to the South Pole